My name is Lena. I'm in my mid-30s, and for most of my adult life, I've been the kind of person people describe as dependable, the one who stays late without being asked, the one who fixes things quietly, the one who never makes a scene. If you met me at work, you might have thought I was calm to the point of being passive. Organized, efficient, maybe a little too agreeable. I wasn't invisible exactly, but I was easy to overlook. The kind of person whose contributions are noticed only when they're missing. This story isn't about revenge. It's not about outsmarting villains or delivering dramatic speeches that make everyone clap. It's about something much quieter and much more common. It's about what happens when responsibility keeps increasing, but recognition doesn't. When trust turns into assumption, when you're so good at this slowly becomes, you'll handle it, right? For a long time, I told myself that hard work spoke for itself. That fairness would eventually correct the imbalance. If I just stayed professional, patient, and consistent, things would work out. They didn't. This story traces a slow emotional arc. Not a single explosion, but a steady accumulation. It's about being given more work without more pay, yes, but it's also about what that pattern does to your sense of self. How it trains you to shrink your expectations. How does it teach others what they can take from you? There's no hero moment here, no shouting match, no public takedown. What you'll hear instead is how silence can change meaning over time. How observation can become preparation. Dignity doesn't always look loud when it finally asserts itself. I'm telling this in the first person because it's the most honest way I know how. Not to paint myself as flawless, and not to pretend I handled everything perfectly. I stayed quiet longer than I should have. I rationalized things I shouldn't have. I mistook endurance for virtue. But I also learned something important. Something I didn't understand at the beginning. That being underestimated is not the same as being powerless. Over the next parts, I'll walk you through how I was seen, how that perception solidified into a role, and how I eventually stepped out of it. Not with anger, but with clarity. The emotional journey matters more than the outcome, and the choices I made weren't about punishment. They were about alignment. If you've ever been the person everyone relies on, but no one really listens to, this story might feel uncomfortably familiar. So before we go any further, let me ask you, have you ever realized you were carrying far more than anyone noticed? To them, I was reliable. That was the word I heard most often, always delivered with a small, satisfied nod, like it explained everything that needed explaining. Reliable meant I responded quickly. Reliable meant I didn't complain. Reliable meant that when something fell through, my name surfaced naturally in the room, as if it had always been waiting there. I wasn't hired to be extraordinary. I was hired to keep things running, to coordinate, to smooth, to catch what slipped between departments. And at first, I liked that role. There was dignity in being steady, in being the person who noticed details others rushed past, in making systems work quietly in the background. People often confuse calm with emptiness. They assume that if you're not pushing yourself forward, there must not be much there to push. I didn't interrupt meetings. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't sell myself aggressively. I listened. I remembered. I followed through. And slowly, without anyone ever announcing it, I became the solution to problems that weren't technically mine. It didn't feel like exploitation at first. It felt like trust. Can you just take a look at this? You're so good at organizing. Do you mind handling it? It'll only take you a few minutes. Those sentences piled up gently, almost politely. Each one is small enough to justify. Each one is easy to accept if you don't step back and look at the pattern forming. In meetings, I was the one people turned to for confirmation, not authority, confirmation. As if I were a reference manual rather than a decision maker. When plans were discussed, my role was to clarify, not to lead, to support, not to shape. I was spoken about in the third person even when I was in the room. Lena will handle that. She's great with details. She doesn't mind. I never said I didn't mind. That assumption was made for me, quietly and confidently, like a fact no one felt the need to verify. What's strange is that I wasn't unhappy. Not exactly. I told myself that visibility wasn't everything, that I preferred substance over spotlight. Promotions and praise were noisy distractions from the real work. But there's a difference between choosing the background and being assigned to it. I started to notice how my name appeared on documents that carried weight, but disappeared from conversations about growth. How my workload expanded laterally, more tasks, more responsibility, but never vertically, no change in title, no change in pay, just more reliance. They trusted me with outcomes, but not with advancement. When new hires came in, I trained them. When managers rotated, I filled in the gaps. When processes broke, I rebuilt them. And when things went smoothly, that smoothness was treated like the default state of the world, not the result of anyone's effort. I was useful in a way that made me easy to overlook. No one was cruel. That's important to say. There were no raised voices, no public dismissals, just a consistent, unspoken agreement that my capacity was available by default, that my boundaries were flexible, that my time was elastic. And because I was competent, because I cared about doing things well, I reinforced that agreement without realizing it. I answered emails at night. I fixed issues before they escalated. I filled the silence with solutions. Each time, I told myself it was temporary, that someone would notice, that this was how trust worked. But trust, when it's one-sided, starts to look a lot like entitlement. I can see now how clearly defined my role was in their minds. I wasn't the person whose absence would be felt as a loss of leadership. I was the person whose absence would be felt as an inconvenience, as a disruption, as extra work for everyone else. I was infrastructure, and infrastructure is only discussed when it fails. At the time, I didn't feel angry. I felt neutral, slightly tired, slightly invisible. I mistook that numbness for professionalism, for maturity. What I didn't understand yet was that this version of me, the dependable one, the quiet one, the endlessly capable one, was being carefully, unconsciously shaped by everyone around me, including myself. The first time it happened, it was small enough to dismiss. I remember the exact moment not because it was dramatic, but because of how ordinary it felt. A routine meeting, a familiar room, the same neutral-colored walls, and the faint hum of the air conditioner that never quite worked properly. We were reviewing a project I had quietly taken over halfway through, after the original lead moved on. I hadn't been given the title, just the responsibility. I reorganized timelines, restructured communication, fixed vendor issues that no one wanted to touch. The project stabilized. Deadlines stopped slipping. When the meeting started, my manager presented the results. He spoke confidently about the improvements, the efficiency, the turnaround. He used "we" a lot. I didn't expect my name to be highlighted, but I assumed, naively, that my role would at least be acknowledged. It wasn't. Instead, when questions came up, eyes turned toward me automatically. "Lena, can you explain that? Lena, do you have the numbers?" I answered as I always did, calmly, clearly. I filled in the blanks of a story that didn't include me as a character. At the end of the meeting, someone said, "Great work, everyone." Everyone, apparently, was a collective I existed inside of, but never stood out from. Later that day, I received an email, a follow-up summary praising the project's success. It listed contributors by department, not by name. It also included a new request. Could I temporarily take ownership of a related task? It would ensure continuity, they said. That was the first small cut. Not because I wasn't thanked, not because I expected applause, but because something in me noticed the asymmetry. The responsibility was specific. The recognition was vague. I told myself I was being sensitive, that work wasn't a performance, that adults didn't need constant validation. I'd always been proud of not needing much, but pride can become a blindfold if you're not careful. Over the next few weeks, similar moments stacked up. Each one is tiny, each one is reasonable on its own. A colleague was promoted into a role adjacent to mine. I trained her for 2 weeks. When she announced her new position in a team meeting, she thanked management for the opportunity. She didn't mention the training. No one prompted her to. Another time, a decision I had recommended was approved, word for word, but presented as a management initiative. I recognized my own phrasing on the slide. Again, I said nothing. Silence is easy when you believe it's temporary, when you think speaking up would be unnecessary or worse, awkward. I didn't want to seem territorial. I didn't want to be that person who keeps score. So I adjusted internally instead. I worked a little harder, documented a little more, told myself that excellence was cumulative, that eventually patterns would be obvious. But here's what I didn't understand then. People rarely notice patterns that benefit them. No one around me saw these moments as cuts. To them, nothing had changed. Systems were running, tasks were being handled. There was no disruption, no complaint to address. The absence of conflict was taken as proof that everything was fine. What made it worse wasn't malice, it was comfort. They were comfortable with how things were, comfortable relying on me without renegotiating terms, comfortable assuming my continued cooperation. and I let them be. There's a particular loneliness in being competent and quiet. You're surrounded by people, yet no one is really checking in with you. Not because they don't care, but because you never give them a reason to worry. That first small cut didn't hurt. Not sharply, it was more like pressure. A subtle realization that something had shifted slightly off balance. I noticed it. I stored it away. I didn't yet understand what it would become. But once you see the first crack, you start noticing where the stress lines are forming. After the first few moments, the pattern didn't announce itself. It blended in. That's how normalization works. Nothing sharp enough to force a reaction, just repetition, a steady rhythm of small dismissals that slowly trains you to accept less without consciously agreeing to it. I started anticipating extra work before it was assigned. I'd see a gap forming in a project and step in before anyone had to ask. It felt responsible. It felt proactive. What it really did was remove the moment where someone might have noticed the imbalance. If you solve problems before they become visible, you also erase the evidence of your effort. I told myself I was preventing stress for the team, for my manager, for myself. I framed it as maturity, as emotional intelligence. But beneath that was a quieter truth. I didn't want to risk being seen as difficult. There's a subtle pressure placed on people who are known for being easy to work with. The moment you stop being easy, you fear becoming disposable. I didn't articulate that fear, but it shaped my behavior. So when more tasks came, I absorbed them. When deadlines tightened, I adjusted. When expectations expanded, I stretched. And each time, I explained it away. They're just busy. It's a growth opportunity. This will look good later. Later, it became a concept I leaned on heavily. A future where fairness would naturally reassert itself, where someone would connect the dots and say, wait, this isn't right. But organizations don't self-correct out of gratitude. They correct when friction appears. I was frictionless. What made the disrespect harder to name was how polite it all was. No one spoke down to me. No one raised their voice. In fact, I was often praised for my attitude. You're so flexible. You always make it work. We're lucky to have you. Those compliments came without follow-through, without conversation, without compensation. I remember one afternoon in particular. I was staying late to finish a report that technically belonged to another department. I'd been looped in just to help, and somehow it had landed fully on my desk. As the office emptied out, my manager passed by and said, "Thanks for covering this. I don't know what we'd do without you." He meant it as appreciation. I smiled and said, "No problem." But after he left, that sentence echoed in a different way. "I don't know what we'd do without you." It wasn't followed by, "So let's make sure you're supported," or "Let's revisit your role," or "Let's talk about your workload." It was said like a fact that required no action. That was when I realized how thoroughly my silence had trained everyone. They didn't see my staying late as a cost. They saw it as a feature, something stable they could rely on without question. Even I started to see myself that way. I lowered my expectations preemptively. I stopped bringing up ideas that might require ownership. I focused on execution rather than direction, not consciously, but gradually. It's easier to adapt than to confront. Easier to tell yourself a story where endurance is virtue than to risk discovering that your boundaries might not be respected. And there was another layer, one I didn't want to admit. Part of me took pride in being indispensable, not in a loud way, in a quiet, disciplined way. I liked knowing that systems would falter without me. That knowledge felt like security. But indispensability without leverage is a trap. The more I did, the more normal it became. The more normal it became, the harder it was to question. Any complaint would now sound sudden, even unreasonable. After all, I had handled it before. That's the psychological trick of normalization. Yesterday's overreach becomes today's baseline. I wasn't being actively disrespected in a way anyone could point to. I was being slowly redefined. My role is expanding without acknowledgement. My limits are assumed rather than discussed. And because nothing ever broke, no one thought to ask if I was okay with it, including me. By the time I noticed how tired I was, the pattern was already established. Not just in policy or workflow, but in expectation. They expected my compliance, they expected my silence, they expected my capacity, and I had taught them well. Roles are rarely handed to you with a title. Most of the time, they're assigned through repetition. By the time I recognized mine, it had already settled into place. I was the reliable one, the stabilizer, the person who would step in without needing to be told. Not a leader, not a decision maker, but the one who ensured decisions, once made, actually worked. When something went wrong, I was looped in early. When something went right, I was looped out entirely. No one ever sat me down and said, "This is what we expect from you." They didn't need to. The expectations were communicated through behavior, through who got invited to certain meetings and who didn't, through whose opinion was the direction shaped and whose role was to implement it. I was the implementer. And once you're seen that way, it's surprisingly difficult to be seen as anything else. I noticed how conversations changed when I spoke. If I suggested an improvement, it was treated as a technical detail, not a strategic insight. If someone else said the same thing later, it was framed as vision. I was allowed to refine the machine but not redesign it. What made this harder was that I was good at my assigned role. Too good. I knew the systems intimately. I understood where the inefficiencies lived. I could predict problems before they surfaced. That competence reinforced the idea that this was where I belonged. People don't like moving pieces that work. So instead of being asked what I wanted to grow into, I was asked how much more I could handle. Can you take this on as well? You're already familiar with it. It makes sense for you to own this. Those sentences weren't questions. They were assumptions disguised as courtesy. I began to realize that I wasn't being prepared for advancement. I was being positioned as support infrastructure, the kind that leadership builds around, not promotes out of. There's a quiet grief that comes with that realization. Not because you crave status, but because you recognize that your potential is being capped by convenience. What struck me most was how natural it all felt to everyone else. They weren't malicious, they weren't scheming, they were responding to the version of me I had consistently presented. Capable, calm, uncomplaining. People don't push against walls that don't resist. I started to see how my name functioned in conversations I wasn't part of. I'd hear it indirectly. Lena will know. Just ask Lena. She'll sort it out. Not, let's see what Lena thinks. Not, Lena should be involved in this decision. There's a difference between being consulted and being assigned. And my role was assigned. At some point, it became clear that stepping outside that role would require friction. It would require me to contradict the narrative everyone was comfortable with. I wasn't sure I was ready for that. There was safety and predictability. I knew how to succeed in this role. I knew how to meet expectations. What I didn't know was what would happen if I challenged them. So I stayed where I was, physically present, emotionally restrained, professionally polished. But something subtle had changed inside me. I stopped believing that effort alone would shift my position. I began to understand that roles, once assigned, are rarely revised unless someone forces the conversation. And I hadn't. Yet, what I didn't realize at the time was that understanding your assigned role is the first step toward stepping out of it. Not loudly, not recklessly, but deliberately. Because once you see the box, you can decide whether to remain inside it or not. The shift didn't happen during a confrontation. There was no argument, no raised voice, no moment where I finally said what I'd been holding back. In fact, no one else noticed anything at all. It happened on an ordinary Tuesday. I had arrived early as usual. The office was quiet, lights still dimmed in most corners. I liked those first 30 minutes of silence. They gave me the illusion of control, time to organize, to think, to prepare before the day started pulling at me. I opened my laptop and saw a new calendar invite. A meeting is scheduled over my lunch hour, mandatory, no context beyond a vague subject line. And attached to it, a note. Lena to prepare summary and action items. I stared at it longer than I needed to. It wasn't the meeting itself, or the timing, or even the task. It was how automatic it all was. How casually my time and effort were claimed without discussion. I realized something then, not angrily but clearly. No one had checked if I was available. No one had asked if this made sense. No one had considered that my workload was already full. They didn't need to, because I had never given them a reason to. I felt a strange calm settle in, not resignation, something more alert. As if a lens had snapped into focus. I thought back over the past year. The added responsibilities, the late nights, the expanding scope that never translated into expanded authority. And for the first time, I stopped asking why they kept doing this and started asking a different question. Why had I allowed it to become normal? That question changed the tone of everything, not in a self-blaming way, but in an honest one. I saw my own role in the pattern, not as a failure, but as a choice made repeatedly in the name of harmony. Harmony, I realized, can be expensive. I closed the calendar invite without responding, not to decline it, but to sit with the discomfort. The urge to immediately comply was strong, almost physical. like a reflex I'd trained myself into. But I didn't act on it. That was the shift. Instead, I opened my notebook, the slim black one I'd been carrying for years. I usually used it for process notes, reminders, and fragments of thoughts I never intended to share. This time, I wrote a single line at the top of a new page. What am I actually responsible for? I didn't answer it right away. I just let the question exist. Throughout the day, I moved through my tasks as usual. I spoke when spoken to. I delivered what was expected. But internally, something had changed. I started noticing how often my time was assumed, how frequently decisions landed on my desk after they were already made, how rarely anyone asked what I thought before acting. And instead of just noting it emotionally, I began to observe it structurally. Who assigned the task? Who benefited from it? Who received credit? Who bore the risk if it failed? These weren't bitter questions. They were analytical. For the first time, I wasn't reacting. I was mapping. That meeting over lunch eventually happened. I attended. I took notes. I summarized action items. But I did it consciously, aware of the pattern I was participating in. And that awareness changed how it felt. At the end of the day, I didn't stay late. I shut down my computer at a reasonable hour. No explanation, no announcement, nothing happened. The world didn't collapse. No one panicked. No emails came in asking where I was. That too was revealing. I went home that evening and felt something I hadn't felt in a long time. Clarity. Not certainty, not a plan, just clarity. I understood that waiting to be recognized was passive. That fairness doesn't surface on its own. That silence can be a choice, but only if it's intentional. I wasn't ready to speak yet. I wasn't ready to act. But I was no longer asleep inside the pattern. And once that happens, there's no going back to not seeing it. After that Tuesday, my silence changed texture. Before, it had been automatic. An instinct shaped by years of smoothing things over, keeping momentum, avoiding friction. Now, it was deliberate. I still spoke calmly. I still delivered. But I stopped filling every gap the moment it appeared. That distinction mattered. When a task was vaguely assigned, I asked for clarification instead of immediately absorbing it. Not defensively, just neutrally. When would you like this prioritized against my current workload? Who owns the final decision on this? Simple questions, reasonable questions. They landed differently than I expected. Sometimes there was a pause. Sometimes a small recalibration. Occasionally the task was quietly redirected elsewhere, not dramatically, just adjusted. I noted that. Other times, the expectation remained. But now it was explicit. Someone had to actually say they wanted me to take it on. That alone shifted the dynamic. Assumption turned into a request, and requests can be evaluated. I didn't refuse outright. I didn't draw lines in red ink. I simply slowed the reflex to say yes. I let silence exist for a moment before responding, long enough for people to notice it. What surprised me was how often they filled that silence themselves. Oh, if you're tied up, we can handle it. Actually, this might belong with another team. Not always, but often enough to prove a point. My silence had been doing a lot of invisible labor before. It was absorbing pressure. Now, by withholding it just slightly, that pressure is redistributed. To them, it probably still looked like compliance. I was still polite, still composed, still reliable. They mistook the quiet for weakness. That misinterpretation worked in my favor, because while my outward behavior hadn't changed much, my inner posture had shifted completely. I was no longer measuring my worth by how much I could carry. I was observing how much was being placed on me, and by whom. I started documenting things, not obsessively, just accurately. What I was responsible for, what I wasn't. What I was asked to do was temporarily. How long did temporary last? I kept notes on decisions, timelines, and ownership, not as evidence for a fight, but as information for myself. Clarity is a form of power when you've been operating in fog. There was another subtle change. I stopped over-explaining. When I agreed to something, I didn't justify it. When I couldn't take something on, I didn't apologize excessively. I don't have capacity for that this week. This would need to be deprioritized if I take it. Neutral statements, no emotion attached. At first, this felt almost uncomfortable, like I was withholding something essential. But over time, it felt cleaner, more aligned. No one confronted me about the change. No one called it out, which told me something important. My previous level of accommodation had never been formally required. It had just been convenient. And convenience rarely argues for itself. Meanwhile, I paid attention. Not just to my workload, but to the system around me. How promotions were discussed, how decisions were framed, whose voices carried weight. I listened more than I spoke. And because I wasn't constantly filling space with solutions, I had room to observe. What I saw was this. Value wasn't distributed based on effort. It was distributed based on perception. And perception is shaped by narrative, not reality. I began to understand that staying quiet didn't mean staying small. Silence could be strategic. It could create contrast. It could expose assumptions without confrontation. They continued to see me as steady, compliant, and non-threatening. They didn't see me recalibrating. That was fine, because the goal wasn't to correct them verbally, not yet. The goal was to understand the structure I was operating within fully and without illusion. Only then could I decide what to do next, and I was no longer in a hurry to be seen. What they never noticed was how much space silence creates when you stop using it to absorb other people's urgency. Because I wasn't rushing to solve everything anymore, I had time. Not just hours in the day, but mental space, the kind that lets you see patterns instead of reacting to them. I started arriving at work the same way I always had. Same posture, same tone, same neutral expressions. From the outside, nothing had changed. Inside, I was paying attention. I began tracing workflows end to end. Not just what I was responsible for, but how information moved through the organization. Where decisions stalled, where accountability dissolved, where risk quietly pooled without anyone naming it. And I noticed something important. A lot of what kept things running wasn't documented anywhere except in my head. Procedures that had evolved informally, relationships I'd built across teams to bypass friction, workarounds that compensated for structural gaps no one wanted to formally address. None of this was maliciously hidden, it was just assumed. People assumed things worked because they always had. They didn't ask how. So I began documenting, not for them, but for me. I wrote down processes as they actually existed, not how they were supposed to. I noted dependencies. I identified single points of failure. I clarified which decisions were reversible and which weren't. It wasn't dramatic, it was methodical. At the same time, I started learning quietly, not in ways that were visible or disruptive. I reviewed job descriptions for roles above mine, not with longing, but with curiosity. I compared responsibilities to what I was already doing. The overlap was uncomfortable. I refreshed skills that had atrophied from overuse of others, analytical tools, strategic frameworks, language that translated effort into impact. I stopped assuming someone else was tracking my contribution. I tracked it myself. There's a difference between knowing you're valuable and being able to demonstrate it cleanly. I had relied on the former for too long. While all this was happening, I continued to perform. Projects moved forward, deadlines were met. From their perspective, everything was stable. They didn't see the preparation because it didn't announce itself. Preparation rarely does. What they also didn't notice was that I stopped being emotionally available as a buffer. I didn't vent. I didn't commiserate about the workload. I didn't reassure people when things felt tight. I stayed neutral. That neutrality made others fill in the blanks. They assumed I was fine, that I was handling things as always. They didn't realize that I was learning exactly how much weight the system could carry without me compensating for it. I ran quiet experiments. I delayed a response by a few hours to see what happened. I redirected a question back to its source instead of solving it. I let a minor issue surface instead of preemptively smoothing it over. Each time I watched carefully. Some things resolved themselves, some required escalation. Some revealed how dependent certain outcomes were on my invisible involvement. None of it caused chaos. That was important. I wasn't trying to prove a point through disruption. I was gathering information. The most telling moments were the ones where someone said, "This usually goes smoother," without realizing why. I never corrected them, because this wasn't about being acknowledged in the moment. It was about understanding the leverage that already existed, whether anyone recognized it or not. I also noticed how language shifted around me. When I spoke less, people listened more closely when I did speak. When I stopped volunteering solutions, my suggestions carried more weight. When I stopped over-delivering, my delivery was noticed. It wasn't fair, but it was instructive. I had been diluting my own signal, and now by pulling back just enough, the contrast sharpened. They still underestimated me, still saw me as steady support rather than a strategic actor. But underestimation has a strange advantage. It buys you time. Time to prepare without scrutiny, time to see clearly, time to decide. By the end of that phase, I wasn't angry. I wasn't even particularly emotional. I was informed, and that changed everything. The reveal didn't come as a rush of triumph. There was no adrenaline, no moment where I leaned back and thought, "I've got them now." It came quietly, the way real understanding often does, through accumulation. One evening, long after most people had left the office, I sat alone reviewing a set of documents I'd pulled together over weeks. Process notes, responsibility overlaps, approval chains, emergency fixes that had quietly become permanent solutions. I wasn't looking for leverage. I was looking for clarity. But clarity, when it's honest, often reveals leverage whether you're seeking it or not. As I laid everything out, something became undeniable. A significant portion of the organization's operational stability ran through me. Not through my title, not through my authority, through my knowledge. I understood systems no one else fully mapped. I maintained relationships that bypassed formal hierarchies. I knew which problems could be ignored and which ones, if mishandled, would ripple outward fast. And most importantly, I knew why things worked. That knowledge hadn't been granted. I had built it slowly, patiently, over years of being the one who stayed behind to fix what others moved past. I sat with that realization longer than I expected. Not because it made me feel powerful, but because it reframed the past. All the moments of being overlooked. All the added responsibility without recognition. They weren't just signs of disrespect. They were also signs of reliance. Unspoken, unacknowledged, but real. I understood then that I had been negotiating from a position of quiet strength without realizing it. And because I didn't recognize it, I never used it. That was the reveal. Not that I had power, but that I had options. Options don't demand action, they demand discernment. I asked myself questions I'd never seriously considered before. What would happen if I stopped compensating entirely? What would happen if I formalized what I already did? What would happen if I left? None of these were threats, they were scenarios. And as I traced them honestly, I saw something else clearly. The system was fragile in specific, predictable ways. Not catastrophically, but enough to matter. That fragility wasn't something to exploit. It was something to respect. I felt no urge to expose it publicly, no desire to prove anything. If anything, I felt protective. These systems involved real people, real consequences. This wasn't a game, so I didn't act immediately. I didn't change my behavior overnight. I didn't hint at dissatisfaction. I didn't start documenting in ways others could see. I kept everything private, because leverage only works if it's paired with restraint. The more I understood, the calmer I became. There was relief in knowing I wasn't trapped, that the story I'd been telling myself about my powerlessness wasn't true, but there was also responsibility. Knowing where pressure points exist doesn't obligate you to press them. Sometimes it simply allows you to choose your next step without fear. I realized then that my silence up to that point had been misinterpreted as passivity, but going forward, my silence would be something else entirely. It would be a pause before the decision. I stopped framing my situation as something happening to me. I started framing it as a system I was participating in and could exit or reshape. That mental shift was profound. I no longer needed validation from people who didn't see me clearly. I didn't need them to acknowledge my contribution in order for it to matter. I needed alignment. By the time I packed up my things that night, nothing outward had changed. The office lights clicked off as usual. The city moved on. But internally, I had crossed a line. I knew what I held. I knew what it was worth. And I knew I didn't have to announce any of it. The next decision would be irreversible. And for the first time, I was ready to make it deliberately. Once you see your options clearly, indecision becomes its own kind of choice. I reached that point quietly, without ceremony. There was no deadline forcing my hand, no external crisis demanding action. Just a growing understanding that staying still would eventually mean consenting to a future I didn't want. I laid out my options carefully, not emotionally, but structurally. The first option was to speak up internally, to request a formal role adjustment, a title, compensation that reflected the work I was already doing. On paper, this seemed reasonable, logical even. But when I imagined that conversation honestly, I saw the risks as clearly as the benefits. It would require others to admit they had overlooked me. It would require restructuring expectations they had grown comfortable with. And it would place me in a position of having to convince people of value they had already been benefiting from. Even if it worked, it would come with scrutiny, with promises, with "let's see how this goes." I wasn't sure I wanted my worth to become a negotiation after so much silent reliance. The second option was to continue as I was, just with better boundaries, to do the work, collect the paycheck, and detach emotionally. Many people choose this. It's stable, predictable. But when I imagined myself a year later, still absorbing responsibility without recognition, I felt something close to grief. Not burnout, not anger, regret. The third option was the one I hadn't allowed myself to consider seriously until then. To leave. Not impulsively, not dramatically, but intentionally. To step out of the system entirely rather than trying to correct it from within. That option scared me, not because I doubted my ability, but because it would remove the familiar structure I'd built my identity around. Being the reliable one had become part of how I understood myself. Letting go of that meant redefining who I was without that role. I sat with all three options for weeks. I didn't rush. I didn't seek validation. I didn't vent to colleagues or friends who might color the decision with their own fears. I paid attention to how each option felt in my body, not just how it sounded on paper. The first felt tight, constrained. The second felt heavy, draining. The third felt uncertain, but open. That openness mattered. What ultimately made the decision for me wasn't resentment, it was respect for myself. I realized that staying quiet forever would slowly erode something essential, and speaking up within a structure that hadn't shown willingness to truly see me felt like asking for permission I didn't need. So I chose the irreversible option, not because it was the most dramatic, but because it was the most honest. Once I made that decision internally, everything else became simpler, not easier, but clearer. I didn't announce it. I didn't change my behavior suddenly. I didn't give myself away through subtle cues. I started preparing. Financially, I assessed my runway. Professionally, I updated materials I hadn't touched in years. Mentally, I practiced detachment, doing my work well without tying it to my identity. I also noticed something unexpected. As soon as the decision was made, my patience increased. Not because I was numbing myself, but because I no longer needed anything from the situation emotionally. I wasn't waiting to be seen. I was moving towards something else. That shift gave me a quiet steadiness I hadn't felt in a long time. I wasn't running away. I wasn't trying to make a point. I was choosing alignment over endurance, and that choice, once made, couldn't be undone. From that moment on, everything I did had intention behind it. Even the silence, especially the silence. Once the decision was made, my life split into two parallel tracks. On the surface, nothing changed. I arrived on time. I attended meetings. I completed my work with the same level of care and precision as always. I responded calmly. I stayed professional. If anything, I became easier to work with, because I was no longer emotionally invested in being understood. Underneath, everything was in motion. Moving in silence isn't about secrecy in a dramatic sense. It's about not broadcasting intention before it's ready. It's about respecting the difference between knowing and announcing. I began by simplifying. I stopped taking on anything new that wasn't clearly part of my role. Not with confrontation, just with clarity. That's outside my current scope. I won't be able to support that long term. No speeches, no explanations. At the same time, I made sure everything I did was clean, documented, and professional. I wasn't burning bridges. I was making sure that when the time came, there would be no narrative of negligence or emotional reaction. Silence requires discipline. I reviewed contracts, policies, notice periods. I made sure I understood the rules better than the people who enforced them. Not to exploit anything, just to move correctly. I also quietly redistributed knowledge, not recklessly, not in a way that would harm anyone. But I stopped being the single point of failure by default. When someone asked how something worked, I explained it once, clearly, and pointed them to documentation instead of handling it myself. This wasn't sabotage. It was normalization. The system had been leaning on me in ways it shouldn't have. I was simply standing upright. No one noticed at first. That was the part that confirmed everything I had already learned. As long as outcomes remained stable, no one looked too closely at how they were achieved. My presence was assumed, not examined. Meanwhile, I prepared for life beyond that role. I had conversations outside the organization, careful ones, not desperate, not reactive, just exploratory. I listened more than I spoke. I learned how my skills translated in environments where responsibility and authority were aligned. It was humbling. I realized how much I had normalized under recognition. How many things I thought were just part of the job were actually senior-level responsibilities elsewhere. That realization didn't make me bitter. It made me precise. I refined how I spoke about my work, not in grand terms, but in accurate ones. I practiced describing impact without apology. I stopped minimizing. And still at work, I remained unchanged. No dramatic withdrawal, no visible frustration, no hints. People continued to assume my availability, continued to plan as if I would always be there, continued to lean on the stability I had built. I let them. Not out of spite, but because premature disclosure would have served no one. Not them, not me. Moving in silence is not about control, it's about timing. You don't announce departure while you're still walking toward the door. You wait until your hand is on the handle. There were moments when it would have been easier to speak, to vent, to correct assumptions in real time. But I reminded myself I wasn't trying to change their perception anymore. I was changing my position. By the time I finished preparing, everything was in place. Not perfectly, but sufficiently. The pieces aligned quietly, without spectacle. From the outside, it looked like nothing was happening. But beneath that stillness, the outcome was already decided. The consequences didn't arrive with an announcement. They arrived as small disturbances, barely noticeable at first. A missed handoff, a delayed response, a question that lingered a little too long without an immediate answer. At first, people assumed it was a fluke, probably just a busy week. She'll get to it. It usually sorts itself out. That phrase, "it sorts itself out," had always fascinated me. As if systems possess some natural intelligence, rather than being upheld by specific people making quiet decisions every day. I continued doing my job. I didn't disappear. I didn't withdraw effort. But I also didn't step in to preempt problems that weren't clearly mine. And slowly, the absence of that invisible buffer began to register. Meetings ran longer. Decisions circled without resolution. Small issues escalated because no one had smoothed them over early. No crisis, just friction. I noticed the shift before anyone else because I knew exactly where the support beams were and which ones I had stopped reinforcing. What struck me most was not the frustration, but the confusion. People didn't ask, "Why is this happening?" They asked, "What changed?" They looked around for variables, new hires, market conditions, process flaws, anything but the obvious. Because the obvious explanation that one person had been compensating quietly for a long time was uncomfortable. I heard my name mentioned more often, not in praise, in inquiry. "Do you know why this is stuck? Is there a workaround for this? Can you jump in on this real quick?" I responded professionally. When something was within my role, I handled it. When it wasn't, I redirected. "This needs to go through. That's owned by Y now." I don't have visibility into that. Each response was factual, non-confrontational. But to them, it felt different. Before, my answers had come with solutions attached. Now, they came with boundaries. And boundaries feel like a loss when people are used to unlimited access. The first real sign of consequence came when a project missed a minor deadline. Not a disaster, just enough to attract attention. There was a post-mortem meeting, slides were reviewed, timelines dissected, gaps identified. No one pointed fingers, but the question hung in the room. Why didn't this get caught earlier? I knew the answer. I had always been the one to catch it. I didn't say that. Instead, I listened as people suggested new checks, new processes, new oversight, all of which sounded suspiciously like the work I had been doing informally. It was strange to watch something you've been providing for years suddenly be recognized as necessary, only after it's gone. Still, no one connected it to me directly. Not yet, because acknowledging that would require acknowledging how much had been resting on me without structure or compensation. So the system tried to correct itself without naming the source of the imbalance. And that's when the strain became visible. More meetings, more confusion, more urgency. People grew tired faster, tempers shortened, not toward me but toward the situation. I remained calm, not because I was enjoying this, but because I had already emotionally exited. I felt more like an observer than a participant. I wasn't rooting for failure. I wasn't waiting for vindication. I was simply no longer absorbing the cost of keeping everything seamless. The consequences weren't dramatic, they were cumulative. And cumulative consequences are the hardest to ignore. By the time the concern became explicit, the window for easy correction had already closed. It started with questions that sounded collaborative but carried a new edge of urgency. Can we revisit how responsibilities are distributed? Do we have documentation for how this usually works? Who's been managing this historically? Those questions circled closer and closer to the truth without naming it. I watched the shift happen in real time. Meetings were scheduled with tighter agendas. Emails were marked urgent more often. People who had once been relaxed about timelines began checking in repeatedly. The system was under strain, and strain reveals dependency. What no one realized, what made it too late, was that my decision had already moved past the point of adjustment. Even if they had suddenly recognized everything, offered a title, increased pay, or reshaped my role, it would have arrived after clarity. And clarity, once reached, changes the threshold for compromise. I was asked to join a meeting with senior leadership. not framed as an intervention, just a check-in. They asked how I was doing, if everything felt manageable, if I had concerns. The questions were careful, polite, a little late. I answered honestly but selectively. I've been managing my scope carefully. I'm focused on my core responsibilities. I think some processes could benefit from clearer ownership. None of that was false. They nodded, took notes, thanked me for my perspective. But they didn't ask the one question that mattered. What do you want? And I didn't volunteer it. Because by then, I wasn't looking to renegotiate. I was finishing a chapter. After that meeting, things accelerated. More attempts at documentation, more redistribution of tasks, a sense of scrambling, not panicked, but reactive. People were trying to rebuild what had existed quietly for years, without fully understanding how it worked. I could see the effort, I could see the sincerity, and still it was too late, not because they were incapable, but because the trust that allows repair hadn't been established when it mattered. Recognition was arriving only after absence made it unavoidable. I felt no satisfaction in that. If anything, I felt a muted sadness, not for myself, but for the time that had been lost to assumptions, for the possibility that had existed if someone had asked earlier. There was a moment, late one afternoon, when my manager said, almost offhandedly, "We didn't realize how much you were handling." It wasn't an apology, it wasn't a confession, it was an observation. And that distinction mattered, because realization without accountability doesn't restore balance, it just acknowledges the past. I accepted it with a nod. By then, my departure was scheduled, quietly, according to policy, no disruption. They didn't know yet. They still thought there was time to fix things, to redistribute, to stabilize. But stability built in a hurry is fragile. I wasn't withholding help out of spite. I continued to do my job well until the end. I answered questions, I transitioned what I could, but I didn't reverse my decision. There's a point where fixing a system would require you to stay inside it longer than you should. And staying out of guilt is just another form of self-erasure. The panic, when it came, wasn't loud. It was subtle, a tightening. A realization is spreading slowly through the organization. Something essential was changing, and no one knew how to stop it. The confrontation, when it finally happened, didn't feel like a confrontation at all. There were no raised voices, no accusations, no dramatic pause before someone said the thing everyone had been avoiding. It was quiet, almost restrained, as if everyone involved understood that intensity would only make the moment harder to control. I was called into a meeting with my manager and someone from senior leadership. The tone was neutral, professional, careful. They had learned I was leaving, not from me directly, but through the process. Paperwork moves faster than emotions, and once it does, it can't be pulled back. They asked why, not angrily, not defensively, just earnestly. I took a moment before answering, not to calculate, but to make sure what I said was clean. I didn't want this conversation to carry heat. Heat invites argument. Argument invites rewriting. I realize that my responsibilities and my role have been misaligned for a long time, I said. And I don't think that misalignment can be resolved in a way that works for me anymore. There was silence after that, not the awkward kind. The kind where people are processing something they hadn't fully allowed themselves to name. They asked if something specific had happened. A moment, a conflict. I shook my head. No, I said, it was cumulative. That word seemed to land. They spoke about how valuable I was, how much they appreciated my work, how they hadn't realized the full scope of what I was carrying. I listened. I didn't contradict them. I didn't argue for myself. I didn't say, "That's what I've been trying to tell you," because I hadn't been trying to tell them, not directly. And that was the point. They asked what it would take for me to stay. This was the moment that would have mattered months ago, maybe even years ago. Now it was just information. I answered honestly. "It's not about a title or compensation anymore," I said. "It's about timing." I needed those questions to come earlier before I had to answer them for myself. That was the closest thing to a confrontation in the room. No one pushed back. No one tried to convince me I was wrong. They nodded, slowly. There was a kind of regret in the air. Not theatrical, not self-pitying. Just recognition that something had been missed. And still, I didn't feel triumphant. I felt calm. The conversation ended respectfully. They thanked me for my transparency. I thanked them for listening. When I left the room, nothing exploded. No doors slammed. The office continued as usual. That was the quiet power of it. No one could frame me as emotional, or reckless, or disloyal. There was no story to spin, only a gap between what had been assumed and what was actually sustainable. In the days that followed, people treated me differently, with more attention, more care. Not because they suddenly understood me, but because loss sharpens perception. It didn't change my path. By the time recognition arrives only in response to departure, it's no longer recognition, it's reaction. And reaction is too late to build something new. I finished my remaining time with professionalism. I documented what I could. I handed over responsibilities cleanly. No bitterness, no speeches, just completion. Who I am now is quieter than who I was before, but not smaller. When I left that role, there was no dramatic reinvention, no sudden leap into a radically different life. Change didn't arrive as a wave. It came as a steady recalibration. The first thing that surprised me was the absence of exhaustion. Not physical tiredness, that faded gradually, but the mental weight of being constantly available, the low-level vigilance, the habit of scanning for problems before anyone else notices them. That weight had been so constant I hadn't realized how much of myself it occupied. Without it, there was space. I began working in an environment where responsibility and authority were aligned more honestly, where expectations were discussed instead of assumed, where reliable didn't mean limitless. And in that space, I noticed how much of my restraint had been situational. I was still calm, still observant, still measured, but I spoke earlier. I asked questions sooner. I named boundaries without apology, not because I had something to prove, but because I no longer feared what would happen if I did. I stopped equating usefulness with worth. That was the deepest shift. For a long time, my identity had been anchored to being needed, to be the one who could handle things others couldn't or wouldn't. Letting go of that felt disorienting at first, but over time it became grounding. I learned that contribution doesn't have to be invisible to be dignified, that competence doesn't require self-erasure, that quiet doesn't mean compliant. I also became more discerning about where I place my effort. I no longer rush to fill gaps just because they exist. I ask whether the gap should exist and who is responsible for closing it. That question alone has changed how I move through every professional space. Looking back, I don't feel anger toward the people I left behind. I don't even feel disappointment in the way I once might have. What I feel is understanding. Systems evolve around behavior. And for a long time, mine taught others what they could expect from me. When I changed that behavior, the system struggled, not out of malice, but out of habit. I don't regret staying quiet as long as I did. That season taught me how to observe, how to prepare, how to move without spectacles. But I also don't romanticize it. Silence is only powerful when it's chosen. When it becomes automatic, it costs too much. Who I am now is someone who chooses her silence and her voice with intention. I don't wait to be seen, I don't wait to be asked, and I don't mistake endurance for integrity. There's a steadiness that comes from that alignment, a calm that doesn't depend on approval, and that, more than any outcome, is what I carried forward. There's a quiet lesson in all of this, and it has very little to do with winning or losing. It's about timing, about noticing patterns before they harden into identity, about understanding that silence, while often framed as grace, can slowly turn into consent if it isn't chosen consciously. For a long time, I believed that fairness would emerge naturally if I just stayed consistent. That effort would be seen eventually. That patience was the same thing as wisdom. What I learned instead is this: systems don't reward effort. They reward clarity. Clarity about roles, clarity about boundaries, clarity about what you will and will not carry. When those things aren't stated, they're assumed. Assumptions almost always benefit the system more than the individual. I also learned that being underestimated isn't the insult we think it is. It's only dangerous when we internalize it, when we start living down to the version of ourselves that others find convenient. The moment you stop needing to be understood by people who benefit from misunderstanding you, something shifts. You gain room to move, to choose, to leave without spectacle. This wasn't a story about revenge. No one was humiliated. No one was punished. And that matters, because the goal was never to make anyone else feel small. The goal was to stop shrinking myself to fit a role I hadn't agreed to. There's dignity in that kind of exit, in leaving without burning bridges, in refusing to turn your pain into performance. Sometimes the most powerful thing you can do is simply stop offering what's being taken for granted. If this story resonates, it's probably not because of the details, but because of the dynamic, the quiet accumulation, the moment of clarity that doesn't arrive with fireworks, but with a deep internal stillness. So I'll leave you with this, not as advice, but as a reflection. If no one ever asked you to carry everything you're carrying, if it just happened, If your silence has become expected rather than chosen, what would it look like to pause and ask yourself why? And more importantly, what would change if you stopped answering before the question was fully formed? I'd really like to hear your thoughts in the comments.